Okay. So we don't have a PowerPoint today, so that's great news. Welcome to the Maine Planning Basics webinar. My name is Tom Mariola, and I'm a senior planner with the Municipal Planning Assistance Program at DACF. These monthly webinars are intended for those that are new to the planning profession. A reminder that these sessions are recorded and posted to our website. I'll post a link shortly to our website where you can find future sessions and these recordings. This recording should be up by the end of the day, if not first thing Monday. A couple updates. We will not be having a session in July. The first Friday in July falls on July 4th, and we've just been skipping July and January. Our next session will be Friday, August 1st. August session will highlight shoreline zoning and the updated guidance. Updated guidance, I believe chapter 1000 is getting updates, or the manual is getting updated. I'll learn with you. It will be presented by Colin Clark, the Shoreline Zoning Coordinator at DEP. Please have your shoreline zoning questions and war stories ready in August. Today, we will have a panel discussion on open space planning in Maine. Greg LeClair will be hosting this session. Greg is a municipal planning biologist with the Beginning with Habitat program. I'll leave it to Greg to introduce the panel. Greg, it's a pleasure to have you, and you can begin when you're ready.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Tom. So as Tom mentioned, I'm the municipal planning biologist within the Beginning with Habitat program at the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. Could be the longest title out there. I think I'm in the running for it. But so what I do, I assist municipal officials with conservation planning, particularly comprehensive plans. And with me today, I have two of our panelists. One of our panelists, unfortunately, had an emergency and is unable to attend, but we have two panelists, and I'll introduce them in just a moment, but just some important housekeeping stuff. During the panel today, if you could just keep your cameras off so that the focus maintains on our panel, at least for now. Maybe towards the end, we'll be able to open up discussion a little bit more, and of course, make sure microphones are muted. If you would like to ask questions, you're welcome to throw questions into the chat at any time, and we'll tend to them as time allows. So today we have Howard Lake, who is the co-chair of the Kennebec Land Trust Lands Committee and a member of the Open Space Committee for the town of Readfield. Howard has provided legal services for landowners and land trusts alike for over 30 years. We also have Matt Markot, Executive Director of Loon Echo Land Trust and a member of the Bridgton Open Space Committee. So to both of you, thank you so much for coming. And I'll open this up with a bit of an icebreaker question, or more of a softball, but please feel free to build more on your experience with this first question. But starting things off, and I'll start with Howard here. Just the basics. What is open space, and why does it matter?
Thanks, Greg. Well, our Readfield Open Space Committee grappled with the question, what is open space, for several meetings, actually. And I think we came to the conclusion that it was publicly owned, undeveloped areas, and it was also privately owned areas. And the benefits, of course, are pretty well known, of forested land and as far as water quality protection, quality of life, scenery. The town of Readfield has a pretty good history of appreciation for open space, I think, and we're continuing work. Readfield did an open space plan in 2006, and our committee now is updating that.
Great. And what about you, Matt?
Yeah, that's not so much a softball question. That is the question, maybe. I mean, I love open space planning. Certainly my professional work as a land conservation professional, leads me in the direction, much the same way as Howard has, in thinking about what it's for, who it's for, and how it can be done. I think, as I think about open space planning in our current context and our the wide spectrum of land use challenges that we're seeing across Maine, I think open space is just as much about wild places, ecosystem function, as it is about people and how people interact within their communities, with their neighbors, and with the natural world. And what gets me really excited about open space planning is that I think it's also an area that a lot of Mainers share a cultural affinity to. And whereas comprehensive planning, I think, can be kind of a big, scary topic, open space planning, I think, is in some ways more tangible for people who are not familiar, have not had experience with planning, to get involved. But and I was joking that it's not so much a softball question, because I think the best open space planning and what it could look like into the future is really a tool where we connect all of these various parts of how we plan growth in our communities, and not as a sort of separate entity, but as a connecting tissue across the planning landscape and the planning perspective, and also across different types of communities: rural, suburban, urban, and the ones that don't necessarily fit into those categories as well.
So just curious, building on what you just described there, is there anything creative that you've seen described as open space, either in your direct involvement with your open space planning or in other open space plans?
Sure, I think you're directing that at me, Greg. Are you asking Howard, or how do you want to do that?
Oh, sorry. Well, we'll push that one to Matt, and then Howard follow up.
Okay. Yeah, this is, I think, a great question. And whereas open space planning, I think, in the past has often been very specific towards open lands, landscapes, the type of public and private open space properties that most of us are accustomed to. I think the future of open space planning, and the area where we can get really creative, is looking at how those places are interconnected across a broader land use landscape. So thinking about everything from how people are accessing those places to the opportunities for open space to serve as important alternative transportation areas, connections to schools, to hospitals, really understanding how open space interacts across a broader community. And again, thinking of it as an important cornerstone in a broader land use strategy.
Howard?
Well, I think we were looking broadly when we first sat down as a committee recently, and as to what open space was, and things like cemeteries, ball fields, all of those. Even though there is some development, all of them serve a purpose. Whether it's as Matt says, community connections and appreciation for heritage and for the recreational needs of the community. So looking at it broadly does make some sense.
And I forget which open space plan it was. And if this was either one of your plans, please let me know. But I remember seeing somewhere that even something like public benches were part of the open space plan, even though they're, it's just a bench on a sidewalk somewhere with a tree over it or something. It was a part of the open space picture for that town, which I thought was really interesting. Probably like one of the smaller units of open space that you could get. So as with many things in municipal subjects, there are, of course, many ways that open space is beneficial and appreciated by folks, but what concerns have you both encountered regarding open space planning? So, for example, I've heard concerns before about either land use and access or changes in land values, or perhaps there are others that you've heard of. So we'll start this one with Matt. Do you have any concerns that you've heard of before?
I mean, there's lots, and they range from, that question about access, especially if we're talking about open space and private land conservation. The question of public access, I think, is always that always comes up, and it's an important one. I think the concern about taxes and municipal tax revenue and the impact that open space has on that has been a big question, although there's been some recent data and a study published from the University of Maine that I think shines some more light on that issue, and perhaps can give us some better data to make decisions there. But I also think that there's a question about open space and how it should be prioritized. in relationship to other community needs and land use needs. So thinking about housing, commercial growth and development, where does open space fit into that picture? And can open space support those other land use models or land use needs? Or can it be a barrier towards creating those other resources that communities and community members need to thrive? So I think that, the concerns, largely speaking, are broad, but I think the specifics really come down to a concern about the competing interests between open space and economic development, and meeting the needs, the broad needs of community members.
Yeah, and I think that a couple of points. One was we did encounter, our planning group had a public meeting soliciting comments before we even really got started on developing a plan. And the only people to show up were a couple of landowners / farmers who were concerned that this open space plan would lead to more regulation. I think assured them that that was not the point of the open space plan, that was going to be decisions for other days, other years. And I think the other thing that is about Matt's comment on the priorities, you only have so much prime farmland. Prime farmland, for example, is much used for development of houses, of which there's a need. It's easy development for solar panels, which is also a need. And so those competing demands can have very different outcomes once choices are made.
Great. And along that subject, and I'm glad you started actually leaning into this one a little bit, Howard. I realized we didn't talk about the benefits of open space yet, and we perhaps should have started with that. So are there any other benefits to a community by having open space?
Well, look at your beginning with habitat maps, Greg, right? What a great resource. All of the mapping that's been done for wildlife and plant communities, for undeveloped blocks, and all of these things that are so easily shown in some of the mapping you've done. Kennebec Land Trust has done some other mapping that we've been looking at. There's so much a resource for wildlife corridors, for trails, for snowmobile trails, for biking trails, walking trails, water quality protection in the Winthrop Lakes area, Readfield area. There's certainly water quality protection of the lakes is very important. So those are all things that we're really focusing on.
And Matt, anything to add?
Yeah, I think there of course is the relationship, the obvious relationship between ecosystem and landscape scale ecosystem function with open space. But I using that example of the park bench, right? If we think about open space planning on these various levels, if you go from the park bench all the way up to the community forest, right? These places are providing opportunities for community connections, for relationships between people. And I'm a believer that those relationships on an individual level are what gives communities the resilience and adaptability to move through a variety of challenging issues. So, I think what I love about open space planning is that we can make this connection between large ecosystem needs, ecosystem function, all the way down to the individual relationships that I believe are critical for the health of the community. And, again, using that bench analogy, right? Like, what's a bench for? It's a place for people to sit, sometimes to have conversation, to build relationships, to build a relationship with a person, or even a relationship with a tree or a space. And so, one way to summarize this is thinking about open space planning as an opportunity to really dig into placemaking and to identify where in a community you can make place. And again, that could be the park bench, or it could be the 12-mile trail system at the community forest.
And I don't think we certainly shouldn't minimize the economic benefits either. The economic benefits of recreation are important, but also the forest economy, the farming economy depend on open space as well.
Absolutely. In one neat little corner of this field that I always love to bring up, this isn't something that benefits Maine towns too much because we see so much green, but perhaps some of you have heard of the benefit of just seeing the color green, the psychological and emotional boost that you get from that access to these green spaces. I mean, this is a bigger problem, of course, for more developed areas than Maine, but maintaining those certainly maintains people to some degree as well.
There's a stretch of road I often drive in Readfield, and it's undeveloped, and there's no utilities, and it's a tunnel of foliage. And I always think to myself, how many shades of green are there in this picture that I have in my mind? It's amazing.
Yeah, more than we can count, I'm sure.
And I would just, Greg, just one comment there. I mean, I think that is a challenge in many Maine communities, that urban green space, and looking at even outside of what we might consider urban cores. I drive the Route 302 corridor frequently, and as you drive through Wyndham, the sort of infamous American strip mall land use model. I think there's even opportunities from a planning perspective to reimagine what those places might look like. How can we interact or create more opportunities for sort of what you might think of as atypical open space within these areas that are lacking the color green, right? So I do think it is actually a challenge here in Maine, and certainly may not be the same as it is in rural Washington County as it is in the city of Westbrook. But the need for that type of planning and open space infrastructure certainly exists here as well.
Yeah, and certainly to not minimize the benefits that could come from maintaining some of these spaces that have lost the color green or vegetation, even just planting some native plants. And I wish I had the book next to me. I'm not at my on-site work desk, but there's a book called Nature's Best Hope by Doug Tallamy, and it's about developing your backyard into a more native habitat type again. And the one take home I got from that is planting oak trees is a tremendous environmental and social benefit. The cooling effect that you get on your house from having an oak tree hanging out over it is pretty immense in the summer. So both of you are coming from communities that have had open space plans longer than most other communities in Maine. And so, of course, most communities don't even have open space plans at this point. But Readfield and Bridgton have some of the oldest open space plans in the state. So I'd love to hear how well it's been implemented, how successful it has been, any notable challenges perhaps that have come up from trying to implement your open space plans. And we'll start with Howard.
Yeah, I was just looking through the recommendations of the 2006 plan, and I think it's gone fairly well. There was a recommendation for recreational use of open space, and it recommended the formation of a trails committee, and that trails committee was immediately formed, and it's been very active. They've have constructed trails and maintained others, and it's very, very active organization in town. There was an encouragement for current use taxation in town, and we've done now an assessment of a listing of those properties that are in tree growth and farm and open space. And we haven't done a comparison to see how that is from 2006, but my sense is that it's certainly more available. And the partnership with the Kennebec Land Trust has been a very good success. Now, and I've got to say that the Land Trust has done most of the conservation acquisition of fee and easement properties rather than the town. However, the town of Readfield set up an open space fund, which was funded with appropriations for several years, and it's over $100,000 now. And of course, $100,000 won't buy you what it could have bought in 2006, I guess, but still, that can be hopefully leveraged into some land acquisition. So I think it's gone pretty well, the 2006 plan, and actually I think it was some questions around that open space fund, like, well, why do we have all this money? What are we going to do with it? I think that sort of led to the initiative of setting up a new open space committee to update the plan. Our charge is not to designate how that money should be spent, but it is to update the plan, and then there will be a discussion about how that fund will be used and what our priorities will be.
And Matt, before we jump to you, I just want to make sure I touch on one thing before we forget that you mentioned, Howard, which was open space tax law. And how does that relate to open space planning? Is that the same kind of lands? Is there a really specific definition? What does that mean?
Yeah, well, the current use taxation programs in Maine of tree growth, which requires a forest management plan for commercial forestry, and that reduces the assessed value considerably. And then there's the farmland, where if there is a minimum requirement of income producing farm properties, which also considerably reduces taxes. And then if someone files for open space, it can be just open land that is not going to be proposed. The owner doesn't have any plans for development in the foreseeable, and they can get a considerable reduction depending on whether it's permanently conserved, open to the public, or even forever wild. So all of those things can reduce the taxation that sometimes forces people to sell or develop their property.
Great, thank you. All right, sorry, Matt, didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no worries. And I need to correct one thing you said, Greg, which said Bridgton has not had an open space plan until the first one was adopted in 2023. So we're a new open space plan. Town did not have an open space plan, did not have an open space committee. One of the first, I think the highest priority recommendation of the open space plan was to develop an open space committee. So that's the first thing we did. And we really think of ourselves as an implementation committee, which I think this could be a whole nother topic about committee structures, how to run committees, but I think it's a great way to do it and to sort of have your guiding document to keep committee members on task, to keep the committee focused. We've been having great success so far implementing recommendations from the plan. And we've been starting small. We sort of took the political approach of wanting to sort of build some credibility of the committee. So starting with projects that we thought had a high likelihood of success. So we've done some wayfinding projects. We've developed a new hand carry boat launch. And we're now in the process of evaluating or reviewing the town-owned land. And making recommendations for what the best uses of those lands should be within the context of the open space plan and also the comp plan. And so we had a site visit yesterday at a tiny little property that's unbuildable in downtown Bridgton. And we are hopeful that we'll be able to work with the select board and Department of Public Works to turn that into the town's first pocket park or a tiny park. And then we were also pretty active in the recent comprehensive planning process. So the timeline was a little funky in Bridgton. We did an open space plan prior to the rewrite of the most recent comp plan, but I actually think it worked out pretty well that way because we were able to engage deeply. When I mean we, I mean the committee and the comp plan process. And one of the biggest concerns we have when it comes to open space is sprawl. Looking at the sort of suburban land use model that's been imported across much of Maine. So like a lot of other places, a pretty big percentage of our town is zoned to 3-acre minimum lot sizes. And we really encourage the comprehensive plan committee to recommend opportunities to focus the growth in our designated growth areas, to look at ways that we can incentivize infill developments, again, with the idea here of reducing fragmentation, moving away from these land use models that we know do have a negative impact on large scale and landscape scale ecosystem function. So we're going to be remaining pretty engaged with the Comprehensive Plan Implementation Committee. We have a liaison between the Open Space and the Comprehensive Plan Implementation Committee. And we're also looking at how we can develop closer relationships with our Planning Board and Ordinance Review Committee, as well as the Comp Plan of Bridgton, which is hopefully will be adopted this fall as that moves into implementation mode.
Great, and apologies on the mix up there on the years. I was
Yeah,
probably thinking
no worries.
I was probably thinking of South Berwick, which was where our other panel members from, and I believe they put their open space plan out somewhere near 2010, but I could be wrong on that one too. So if either of you could offer advice to our audience, let's say they're now interested in starting an open space plan, or creating this plan, or trying to implement their plan, what would your advice be? And Matt, we can start with you.
And maybe Howard will answer this pretty similarly. I think, in my experience, so much of this comes down to the people who are engaged with it and who are seeking to implement it. So it's really all about the level of energy, enthusiasm, engagement, stubbornness of the people who are engaged. And I look at some of the towns that we're working with right now, and when it comes to how on this, I sort of, at least personally, assess their level of function. It always comes down to, do you have that sort of critical mass of engaged volunteers who are willing to put the time and energy in? And so I would just recommend, right off the bat, if there's an interest in whether it's developing an open space committee or looking at the opportunity to do some open space planning, you got to assemble your team first and foremost, and identify, where your allies are politically in the process. So, looking at the select board, trying to understand what the barriers may be there, or a town council. But it all comes down to people. And these plans, as most people know who are on this call, I'm sure, don't implement themselves. And so having a dedicated team is probably the most critical component of it. And I'll pass it over to Howard.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that, Matt. Readfield had gone through a process of forming a working group to decide the future of the Readfield Fairgrounds, which was a town-owned property. There was a proposal to build a softball field there, and it was very expensive, and it failed at town vote. And so there was a decision made to set up a working group, and the select board did a good job. They picked representatives from many of the other boards and committees in town, and then selected several at-large members. And that worked out pretty well for the town. And so when it came to updating the plan, they said, let's follow the same format. So we have representatives from Conservation Commission, Trails Committee, age-friendly community, and then several other members. I'm actually a representative of the Kennebec Land Trust, wearing my hat there, and I've certainly been involved, in town government in different positions. But I think that we quickly found out that there were some people that really weren't that interested in the job in open space. The cemetery committee member was actually passed away, and then the rec board person went on was too busy coaching. But I think we've got a good group with the at-large people. But we did decide that there were a few other people in town who weren't on that committee that had a great experience either with land use planning or open space or conservation in general, and we invited them specifically to a meeting to give their thoughts, and that was very helpful too. So I think to find a group of activists who are willing to spend the time and do the work, and then get input from people that really know the town is very important.
Yeah, and that collaboration, I'm sure, just drives things so much farther. So we have a question in the chat from Janet. Can you discuss the purposes for keeping lands as open space? I work for the floodplain program, and open space is recommended in floodplains. Is that something that either of you can speak to?
Sure. I guess that maybe would take it a step back and just sort of make the connection. I'm glad this question was asked between open space planning and climate resilience and resilience planning. And in fact, I think there might be a question later about how you fund an open space plan. And in Bridgton, we used CRP, Community Resilience Program funds, to fund the actual open space planning process and making the connection to climate resilience, infrastructure resilience, et cetera. So obviously, you know, if we're protecting land in floodwaters or in floodplains, we're thinking about resilience to floods. You know, we could be thinking about aquifer recharge, certainly shade trees, you know, all those things. And so I think, you know, making the connection between open space planning and community resilience to climate change, I think is a really great strategy and can enhance your planning work even more, and also help you bring on maybe some allies that would perhaps be sort of atypical. You know, for instance, like a public works director or someone who engages more with, you know, the built environment and infrastructure.
One thing that I have heard was looking forward to having DeCarlo on for is the relationship between open space and FEMA, where FEMA has a program where you can enroll open space properties to reduce town insurance, I believe. I'm very unfamiliar with this program, and I only just started learning about it, but perhaps, Janet, that might be what you're leaning into, is that program. But that, again, that's something that I wish I knew more about. But I think just for publicity's sake, this is a program that exists where having open space lands in floodplains is a way to reduce costs on your town. I kind of think of it like as a larger scale floodplain ordinance of sorts. Yes, CRS, that's what it's called. Community Rating System gives credit for keeping floodplains as open space. Yeah, so Janet, I'm going to guess that you're probably more of an expert than I on this, and I wish that I could offer more information.
There's also examples of FEMA, for instance, in communities that have been affected by floods, FEMA working with communities to actually hand over fee simple to remediated or to restored floodplain land. So, you know, if you have a home that was affected by a flood, then that land might be better served as an actual functioning floodplain to be given back to a community, turned back. And there's a great example actually in Keene Valley, New York, in the Adirondacks, of a community that has done this and actually developed a series of parks. I think it's along the Ausable River, and it did flood again, but it did not destroy any personal property, and it functioned as it did. I know it took a long time for the actual process of the land to be transferred from FEMA to the community, but it was an interesting case study.
Excellent. Yeah, we always love case studies here. Question from Justin. Howard mentioned the town's legislative process. Can you talk about your experience working open space plans through your municipality's legislative process?
Well, these plans that Readfield did not go through town meeting vote. They were prepared by committee, taken to the select board and endorsed by the select board, and that's as far as those were taken. The comprehensive plan, of course, did get voted on by the town. That was voted on. Readfield updated their plan a couple of years ago, and that was approved by town meeting vote, which in Readfield is now done by referendum. So I suppose if you know, like anything else, if you want to take a plan through the town meeting process, it's a political fight, right? I mean, you just gotta sell it to the public and hope that intelligent minds will prevail.
Now a question from Jim from Deer Isle, and this is a question that I was actually hoping to dig into later. So how do you feel about encouraging larger open space areas in subdivisions by clustering housing? Should towns recognize the open space property tax exemptions? What if some of that open space was designated for public recreational trails and other access?
I would say yes to all those things. Yes. I mean, I think one of the problems we run into is it's illegal to build like that in many towns, given the current status of their land use ordinances, their zoning codes. So, I mean, I think that's the first hurdle we need to overcome is the legal hurdle, and also just the cultural sort of aversion to that type of development. But yes, I think absolutely. And there are examples of this all throughout the country, including some really innovative examples with developers working with land trusts to conserve land and sort of as part of the financing model to make these development projects pencil out. And then, yes, I mean, Howard gave a great primer of Maine's current use tax law. And so in this, potential situation, absolutely, I think that land could, that's not developed could be enrolled in current use to decrease the tax liability on the owner. And I always feel strongly that where there's opportunities for public recreation, that's an important way of building that culture in a community of care and interest in open space planning. Obviously, there's some places where trails and recreational infrastructure may not make sense for a variety of reasons, but especially if we're talking about a location adjacent to where people are living, I think that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, the town of Readfield does Readfield U, which is like an educational program, series of programs in March of each year. One of the topics that was the subject of a little talk was this very topic of and we had a panelist from Grow Smart Maine, and you should talk to them about this whole issue. And they have a lot of resources on smart growth and how to take advantage of consolidating growth in the growth areas to avoiding sprawl, which is costly for public services. One of the difficulties is from wearing my land trust hat is we oftentimes get requests to hold conservation easements on subdivision designated undevelopable land, and that's nothing but a headache for the land trust for monitoring stewardship. And so you've got to be careful about what rules that would apply to the site, and make sure that it is in fact solidly conserved by deed covenants and by the permits. But yes, those are all important, and if you can cluster, that's a wonderful thing. One of the things that we're going to be, I think, wrestling with a bit is rural zoning. Over the years, in Maine and in Readfield in particular, we've had our village areas, we've had our rural residential areas, we've had our shoreland area, and then we got everything else, the rural areas. And we say, well, you can't do this in the residential areas, you can't do this in shoreland, but throw it all in the rural zone. And mobile homes are allowed, mobile home parks are allowed, commercials allowed. And boy, that's just against everything that we're talking about here in conservation of open space. So the question is, do we have the stomach to propose some rural zoning, some farm zoning, or like the city of Auburn has done, I guess, it was fairly controversial over the last year or so around Lake Auburn. I'm not awfully familiar with the nuts and bolts of their ordinances, but that was something that the comprehensive plan in Readfield looked at and said, if we're really going to get serious about open space protection, we need to address the rural zone.
There was a great document that I had come across sometime last year that provides recommendations for open space planning in contexts like subdivision planning. So I'm going to paste a link to that document. So this is from 2012. Some of these practices might be out of date, but there are examples from Maine in here. And one of the takeaways that I have shared with towns, and very similar to what Howard just shared, is making sure that you're defining some of those important pieces of open space planning and subdivisions, like who's responsible for it, for how long, what has to be conserved. Because if you don't define those things, it can easily end up including the wrong things, or including things that aren't valuable, or arrangements that aren't necessarily valuable. So there's some good examples of some towns in there. And then another town that I want to kind of highlight that I came across, I think sometime last year, was Winslow. A lot of their subdivisions, their subdivision requirements anyway, include connectivity piece of open space. So not just open space itself, but it has to be connected to other pieces of open space. And that's another important piece of that puzzle that Matt had also touched on earlier. And then we have a question from Tom. I'm assuming there isn't a website that has an inventory of open space plans, one-stop shop for open space plans with examples. To my knowledge, there is not, but at least here at Beginning with Habitat, we do provide towns with examples of these things. Matt or Howard, have either of you come across a tool like this?
No. Readfield's plan, 2006 plan, is on our website if anyone wants to look at it. That was professionally done, professionally facilitated back in 2006. It was quite nice, quite pretty.
Yeah, I'm not aware of sort of a one-stop shop for these things, but I will say that there have been some excellent examples of open space planning, recent open space planning in Maine, in our area. I can think of, and I'm proud of the one we did in Bridgton, but also the town of Wyndham, South Portland, Scarborough, as some examples. And yeah, it'd be interesting to think about if there's a way that we could sort of host, or someone could host these documents. But I think sometimes Google might be your best friend in these instances as well. But I do just want to reiterate that I think there's some great open space planning happening in Maine, or has happened recently. And so, holding those up as examples, I think, is a great way to show people who are not familiar with open space planning what it actually can look like.
I've got to say, I was charged with writing a section on the benefits of forests. And I tell you, AI was great. I mean, it came up with an incredible list, and I never would have come up with all of those topics. But I'm pretty sure it was accurate. I did check it.
Well, there we go, folks. Just have Chat GPT write your open space planning.
Open space planning, boom, you'll have it.
I think we're laughing about it, but it's a great point because when it comes to funding, right? I mean, if you're talking about working with a planning consultant group to do a plan, I mean, the cost can get pretty significant pretty quickly. And so if you're working in a town that has limited resources or limited appetite for planning, but energy on the part of, sort of grassroots energy on the part of volunteers, I think there are ways to be innovative and to do good work with very little, right? And so, doing your research on comprehensive plans, finding what you like, copying, pasting, using Chat GPT, right? Like there's no plagiarism police exists when it comes to open space planning. So I just feel like it is possible to do open space planning without a ton of resources, given the technology and access to good planning that's already happened across the state.
And I do want to mention too, so one of the things that I do in my role is try to keep track of towns that are doing conservation actions. And one of the things that I do track is which towns have open space plans. So I do have what is probably the closest thing to a master list of towns that have open space plans or open space like documents. Open space planning is, I think, a new enough thing where some towns have developed something that is an open space plan, but have named it something else because the term open space plan hadn't even really come together yet. So by my count, there are 43 towns in the state of Maine that have an open space plan or open space plan like document. So if you're a regional planner or a town that is working on an open space plan and you're looking for information about which towns might have produced a plan or some good examples, here at Beginning with Habitat, we should have some good examples that we can share with you. So that's probably the closest thing to a one-stop shop that we can currently get. Olivia from HCPC wants to know, Howard, how did you phrase your question to ChatGPT?
Yeah, as best I recall, I just asked, what are the benefits of forests in the Northeast or something like that? And it came up with quite a list. It's great. And then I think I looked at the Maine's climate plan, the recently unveiled climate plan, which also had some good facts and figures as well.
Now, one thing that I think is interesting is that both of your towns, both I believe less than 6,000 for population, Readfield maybe more like around 2,000 or 3,000 folks.
Right.
You both have open space plans developed, which, you know, for relatively rural towns, some folks might be in this position of like, well, you know, we don't have a whole lot of development pressure. Why would we want to develop something like an open space plan? Is that something that either of you could speak to?
I guess I would perhaps reject the notion that we don't have a whole lot of development pressure, or that we shouldn't plan for a future where we may have more development pressure. But even in the absence of like a perception of development pressure, I think there's still many reasons why open space planning makes sense for rural communities. And one of them, I think I'll tie it back to something I mentioned earlier, comes back to access. And especially in rural communities, Readfield and Bridgton are somewhat similar in the fact that they lie in the middle of in a region with abundant lakes and waterways. And something that I hear a lot from people that we serve here in Bridgton is that they feel there's a real lack of access to those lakes and waterways because of just the legacy of private land ownership. And so thinking about open space planning as an opportunity to sort of serve more people and to return access, public access to more places, I think is an important reason to do that. And related to that is thinking about Maine's long-standing cultural tradition of permissive trespass. And so, you know, we've benefited for generations and generations of the ability to access open space. And I think it's fair to say that that tradition is weakening. And so rural communities are thinking more and more about what that means, both in terms of way of life and also economic realities when it comes to how we access open space. So, you know, I think you can come up with a lot of different reasons why open space planning is important, even in those towns where the perception of development pressure isn't as high. But again, I would just, you know, say that we can't count on that always being the case. And, you know, speaking to a whole bunch of planners, you get that, and that's why we plan.
Yeah, and the Kennebec Land Trust almost all of the land that we own in fee, hunting is available on those properties. And we hear so often thanks from hunters who are continually being locked out of their traditional spots. And it's interesting, and you know, we view it as a means to control wildlife that may be out of control otherwise, and as part of the rural character of our area.
Excellent. And Matt, just to catch me up a little bit on the lore of Bridgton. So development was a little bit of a pressure in creating an open space plan. Was that pressure there prior to COVID, or is that like a post-COVID pressure?
Both, I would say. And like many communities across Maine, you know, that sort of escalation of development pressure was significant. Bridgton, I think, had the highest number of housing starts of any town in Maine in 2024, which is, you know, pretty amazing for a town of less than 5,000 year-round residents. And so I think there's a realization, right, that we're growing, we're changing, and that's inevitable. And how can we use planning processes as tools to guide that change? I mean, this is, you know, again, nothing profoundly new to the folks in this room, but the communities don't have a whole lot of options, or have not typically have a whole lot of options other than planning, and then using those planning tools to influence policy, right? And so we're following this game plan, which has been around for a long time. But I think the difference in Maine is that the muscle for planning has not, especially in rural communities, has not been particularly well developed, right? And so there's a need to sort of reframe or to redevelop a culture of planning in rural communities, especially ones like Bridgton, where there's a great degree of development pressure. And that can, I think, be the harder work, right? How do you change people's perceptions of planning, and why should we plan, and what are the desired outcomes from the planning process? that takes some education.
So it can almost be like this protective move too, like maintaining your town's character, for example. Question from Lee. What role does identifying and preserving sensitive wildlife habitats and corridors play?
Well, it's certainly something that the beginning with habitat maps look at, and it's something that I think means a lot to people to have wildlife areas. In fact, there was a moose in our neighborhood 2 weeks ago.
All right.
Which is, it seems like somebody sights a moose every couple of years around town. It's like, wow, where'd that come from? Where does it stay when it's not in our backyards? But so I don't know, Greg, I don't know, maybe you know better. To what extent can we accurately identify those? I mean, we can certainly preserve them once they've been identified, but how can we identify them properly? I mean, I think you mentioned there was a limit to how much of the deer yards are now being mapped. What's the limit there?
Yeah, so I mean, as far as significant wildlife habitats go, so for those that don't know, we in Maine we have some wildlife habitats that are a little bit special. They're regulated under the Natural Resources Protection Act, and they include things like significant vernal pools, inland waterfowl and wading bird habitats, and then if you're coastal, there's some shorebird habitats as well. And some of those habitats are more detectable than others. So for example, seabird nesting islands, relatively easy to determine compared to a significant vernal pool where, we can't find that with satellite imagery or, standing on a boat with binoculars and watching from a distance kind of thing. Like you have to be there and walking the land looking for them. And not every vernal pool is going to be a significant vernal pool. Only about a quarter of those pools end up getting protection because there's certain conditions that they need to meet. So finding those habitats and determining them is a bit of a challenge in itself, but also the corridors is also challenging. And there's a whole field in wildlife research where folks are debating on how we determine what a wildlife corridor is. And, there's all sorts of GIS and mathematical models that will predict these routes that wildlife may use, but very few of them are actually accurate when compared with actual movement data of let's say somebody makes a model for deer or moose. Very few of them match up well with real world data, and it's really that real world data that is the most informative, but it's the hardest to get. We don't have moose collar information for the entire state, so it's hard to tease those things apart. So it's difficult. It requires, I think, some careful eyes, but there's some things that you can notice that work. So, I mean, if you look at your landforms, for example, do you have mountains? Do you have lakes? Do you have ponds? These are all things that will guide wildlife in certain directions. And if you look at Maine DOT's wildlife collision data, you can often see where these pinch points come together. So let's say you have two lakes on either side of a road, and then suddenly you have a ton of road collision data there for deer. It's like, okay, they're being funneled to this one position. So sometimes you're able to pick it out, and sometimes it's quite difficult, and it's going to vary by species too. A corridor for a wood frog is going to be different than for a moose, which will be different than a hermit thrush and all these other species. Matt, is there anything that you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that this is one of the more fun aspects of open space planning, or can be, is just getting out the maps and as part of a community engagement process and asking people like, hey, where are you seeing species movement? And that, like, who doesn't love to come out and put a pin on a map and say, this is where I see the same deer every day crossing the road, or like I saw a moose here once, like 3 years ago, and then someone says I saw a moose there too, right? It's like, this is a way of gathering real data to inform where these corridors actually exist on the land. and then to be able to incorporate that into your open space planning process. So local data is, to your point, Greg, I think is the best way we can understand where these are. I mean, I'm kind of a geospatial geek, so I love some of these emerging models and analysis processes to try to understand, using our geospatial tools, where these things exist, where these corridors exist. But yeah, the best way to do it is just to ask people, and then to use data that does exist. I mean, yeah, the roadkill data is great for that as well. But yeah, that was the most fun meeting that we had in our Bridgton planning process, was getting out the maps and people saying, this is where I'm seeing wildlife.
Yeah, Howard, I'd be curious to see where that moose landed in comparison to your previous Readfield open space plan, because I remember seeing arrows on the previous Readfield open space plan for corridors, and I wonder if that moose might have followed one of those corridors into town.
Well, if I'd been around at the time, I would have been right on its heels to find out where it was going.
Very cool. Question from Joan. Is there a difference in the success of developing and implementing open space plans in communities that are part of a land trust versus those that are not? Great question, and probably one that's really well suited for both of you. So who wants it first?
I mean, I would say yes. Howard, you'd probably say the same thing. I mean, I think when you're thinking about building your team, right, looking at partnerships, organizational partnerships, land trusts, I think are great candidates to be a part of that, and not just because of the technical expertise, potential assistance for fundraising, etc., but also because of the relationship networks that they can help tap into. So yes, I don't know that there's ever been a study, but I would imagine if you look across those 46 communities, Greg, that you said had plans?
43.
43. I imagine there might be a correlation there if we dug into that data between those communities and sort of active, robust land trusts. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But I think the answer is probably yes. And Howard, I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I think the Kennebec Land Trust has had great support. Our municipal partners. We the land trust pays taxes at the open space rate on all of our fee properties. That certainly helps. But I think with the land trust sort of carrying the laboring oar on land conservation, it making the job a lot easier for the open space advocates in the town. And I think there's also some benefit to having a nonprofit separate from the government, who can hold an easement or can actually own the property. It's surprising. Well, I guess it's not surprising given where we are today in the world, but that landowners who want to protect their property will trust the land trust more than they would trust the government. And sometimes I remember I was doing a presentation to some landowners on land conservation with the small woodlot owners, SWOM at the time, now Maine woodland owners, and somebody said, well, how can I trust the land trust to keep my land for in undeveloped? And before I could answer the question, somebody said, well, I trust them more than I would my children. So there's some trust there with the land trust, and I guess that's why we have it in our names. But if you don't, Joan, if you don't have a land trust in your community, there are some statewide land trusts. I mentioned the Maine woodland owners that do hold land. The Maine Forest Society of Maine is a statewide land trust. There are others that might be partners in your area.
And building on that too, so Matt, you had mentioned there might be some correlation between who has an open space plan and their access to a land trust. And there are, I believe, a dozen towns or close to a dozen in the area of Bangor that have, I believe it's either the Bangor area green plan or the Penobscot Valley green plan, something along those lines. And that was facilitated by the Trust for Public Land. And it knocked out, a dozen of these towns in one plan. And that's something that is also certainly possible, is you can make this a collaborative effort between multiple towns. It doesn't need to just be one town at a time. Justin, also building on this, is there a role land trust can help with capacity with facilitating the development of these plans?
I think that's probably a question for, like, your individual land trust, right? I can speak for ours, and I think the answer is absolutely yes. And part of that is because we see open space planning as a primary strategy for achieving, broadly speaking, our natural resource protection and community development goals. So we devote staff time, resources to this work that helps move the process along. And we've assisted with fundraising. We're actually right now in the early stages of working with the town of Casco to develop another open space plan. And in this case, we're actually going to be the fiscal agent for that work. So we'll hold the contract with the planning entity that's doing the work, which has made it a lot easier for the town of Casco to move through the process. So yeah, I think the answer is absolutely. And I've put the call out to my land trust colleagues, and will continue to find ways to make this more of a priority in the communities where they serve, because I think there is a lot of both technical expertise and also getting back to those relationship networks that land trusts have that can support more open space planning across the state.
And the Kennebec Land Trust, I mean, this depends on a land trust by land trust question, but KLT did a strategic land conservation plan for our 22 town region. We've came up with I think there were a dozen different areas of interest, archaeological sites, water quality, farmland conservation, wildlife, and then all of our board members were given 100 points and to allocate amongst those 12, and we set some priorities that way, and then did some mapping to overlays for all of those areas, and came up with some maps that will light up the sky when you get to the real important areas that adjacency to conserved land and undeveloped blocks, I got to say, was ranked quite highly. And so that fits certainly right into the open space planning that the towns are looking at.
Yeah, getting to get that open space next to places that are going to be permanent space in perpetuity, that just makes them so much more valuable. It's that idea of connectivity. The next two questions I have for you both are related to creating these plans. And I think the one that might be on a lot of folks' minds is, how much might this cost, and how can a community pay for creating an open space plan? And I think, Matt, you mentioned something about this earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think cost can range. And as I mentioned earlier, I hope that, we can help. I hope that this isn't always going to be a barrier, right? And I'm familiar with many plans actually, that have been written almost entirely by volunteers with assistance from professionals, volunteers, land trusts, etc. But if you're seeking to go the route of working with professional planners to develop a plan, I think there are options for how you can pay for that. And as I mentioned previously, we worked with the town of Bridgton and through the state's Community Resilience Partnership to access funding to pay for that plan. In the case of Casco, we're actually accessing money through the EPA. It's ARPA-related funds that are somehow still flowing. Fingers crossed for now on that one. And then I think there are also opportunities looking at the private philanthropic space to help fund these as well. And again, that's where partnering with nonprofits, I think, can be really important or really useful for accessing funding for these plans. And Greg and Howard, you may have some other thoughts, but when you look at the Community Resilience Partnership, there's doing this type of work is specifically eligible. And I think most communities have used CRP funds for infrastructure upgrades, and that makes a lot of sense. But especially for communities who might be in their second or even third round of funding through the partnership, I'd encourage them to look at planning as a use of those funds.
Yeah, our committee has no appropriation for this plan update. Certainly, if we were not If we were starting from ground zero, we would need funding. But we're doing pretty well. And I expect that maybe one of our recommendations would be for the future and for implementation to ask for an appropriation, but we haven't quite got to that point yet.
So when the plan was first developed, Howard, were there funds made available for the creation of the plan?
Yes. Yeah, I was going to look that up, but I'm sorry I didn't. Brian Kent Associates was the consultant on the plan and did a great job putting it together. I don't know what the cost was. I mean, obviously it was close to 20 years ago, so I don't know what the cost would be today. But so they did some mapping that might that some of that might be available from beginning with Habitat to today that wasn't available back then, but there was an appropriation.
Now, I only have 2 questions left, so if there's anybody who wants to throw any last ones in before we end at 1:30, this would be the time to do it. But this next one, who from my community should I involve in an open space plan? And we've already heard a little bit about who we should, but let's be explicit. Who should we involve? And Howard, go ahead and take this one first.
Well, just judging from our committee and the group that was on last time, I think we had an active conservation commission, and a lot of those folks have been very actively involved. You want busy, involved people, right? Isn't it what they always say? If you want something done, find a busy person to do it, because they're the ones who can get motivated and accomplish something. Being near Augusta, I think we're fortunate to have a good group of citizens to help out with expertise in planning and natural resources. So we're fortunate that in that respect. Certainly, land trust folks, people that have worked for nonprofits are all helpful. And we have as a chair of our group a former select board member who's really done a tremendous job in organizing and motivating folks. So that's the type of team that you need. And then ask for help too. Greg gave a presentation to us early on, as did folks from the land trust, the mapping folks from the land trust. So look around and see who in the community is motivated and interested, and go from there.
I don't have a lot to add. I think that's a great summary. I mean, I think maybe one thing I would add is, and this is something that I'm thinking more and more about, is who might be sort of atypical people that you wouldn't think of necessarily as advocate for this type of work. Young people. I think that's one example that comes to mind. If you can get a young person or a group of young people to go speak in front of a select board or a town council about why open space matters to them, I think that can be pretty compelling. I think about other groups, organized groups, maybe mountain bike trails or trails organizations or trail groups. But yeah, I'm thinking more and more about sort of atypical people that have not typically been involved in an open space planning process or thinking about open space, but who are stakeholders and who could help to make your argument more compelling.
Good point, Matt. When we had our sort of listening session with some invitees, I specifically requested that a certain younger person that I know, he's got one newborn and another one on the way, and then a young farmer too, to come forward, and he talked about the difficulties that he had in leasing property and not being able to find land that he could affordably buy. So, it's great you look around and I'm in my 70s, and you see other people of your vintage that and have lived in town a long time, and that's you do need different voices. Good point, Matt.
Now a question from Joan. Is there an ideal time frame for when an open space plan be updated? Are there triggers for updating the plan? And these are different, of course, than comprehensive plans, right? Where there's like this kind of 10-year cycle for comp plans. So what's the take with open space plans?
Yeah, there's no statutory requirement to update an open space plan after it's been adopted. I think one consideration here is just thinking about using open space plans as a way to generate enthusiasm and interest. So, if your open space plan has been sitting around for a while, hasn't been used, but you've got an interested person who wants to get involved, that could be sort of maybe a first step, is thinking about the updating process. There's so many different aspects, scenarios within any given community that I think could be used as examples for what that time frame is, and I wouldn't guess what all those might be in any given community, but I think the time is right, probably most places right now. And as we're thinking about the future of our state, as we expect people to continue to need places to live and work. I think the latest data from the state is something like a shortage of 80,000 housing units across the state. So, we know that there's a need for more infrastructure development to support people, to support communities, to support a transition into a greener economy. And so I think the time for open space planning is, broadly speaking, right now. But again, on that individual level, on that individual community level, I think the impetuses can be broad and range.
Yeah, and I think you basically should look at the existing plan and say what's missing here, or what recommendations have not been accomplished. Just looking at our list here, there were several topics that don't really appear in our 2006 plan. Dark skies, that wasn't in the 2006 plan. The whole there was very little on climate resiliency in that plan. Grasslands, Readfield has some grassland, and grassland habitats are increasingly important that may not have hit the radar as heavily back in 2006. So I think you can look through the table of contents of the prior plan and probably recognize immediately that there are some things missing that should be considered now.
Now, a question from Yvette, looking for a timeline or roadmap, I think, to how long this process may take. Can Bridgton share some info? I'm looking to write a CRP grant for writing an open space plan, and Yvette provided her email there. So Matt, sounds like you might want to follow up with Yvette, but could either of you provide an idea for how long this process takes?
And I would just say that I would actually recommend that you reach out to the community development office in the town of Bridgton. I'm sure they would be willing to even share the grant application that they submitted with you as an example. Timeline roadmap, I mean, I think it can range. In my experience, if we're looking at sort of like from start to finish of a consultant facilitated process, that might be like 6 months perhaps, but again, it might take you a lot longer to get to that point where you've got your funding in place, you've got the political will to do it. But I think, generally speaking, to do a good effort in terms of community engagement, to have the opportunities for revisions, drafts, etc. I mean, I think 6 months is a pretty good timeline for that.
I think for our volunteer group, it's going to be a year.
Yeah, it's always nice to have those cases to calibrate against. All right, so I have one last question for you both, and this is a real curveball for you. So I'll start with Matt with this one. What is your favorite? What is your favorite thing about open space planning?
I think I kind of mentioned it earlier, but I'm someone that very much believes in operating at the systems level and seeking to understand the interconnected nature of the way our communities grow and the way people live their lives. And so I think open space planning offers a really creative way to engage at that systems level. And so thinking about how people move around a community, how people interact with wildlife, how people see their relationship to a community has a lot to do with, and especially in Maine, with open space and access to open space. So I think the comprehensive planning process that we have here in Maine is good. It works. But in terms of where we might be able to find most opportunities for creativity and innovation with planning, I think open space offers a realm to do that.
And Howard?
Well, I enjoyed learning, I guess, personally. Just the different folks on this committee. Most of whom I knew a little bit. Some I knew quite well, but just hearing different points of view. And there was one horsewoman on the group, and I learned after about 20 minutes of discussion that horse poop wasn't that bad, according to her. So anyway, I of course had avoided it on the trails, but anyway, just hearing the different points of view is interesting. The points of view of some of the farmers who came in and talked with us is interesting and important. So I enjoy that aspect of it. But I think, of course, in the bigger picture, just looking over the various areas in town and learning a little bit more about them and the importance of the wildlife habitats and things like that I didn't know about, even though I've been in town for 40 plus years. That's interesting as well.
Greg, I wanted to add just one other thing too, that I think there's a level of self-interest that can be fun about these processes too. So, I mentioned the hand carry boat launch that was an implementation step in our plan that we developed. Well, I get to use that, right? I used it yesterday when it was really hot out. So, I think there's nothing wrong with a little bit of self-interest. And I think that can actually be a motivating factor for people to get involved and say, hey, you really, you've been talking about like this skate park for a really long time. Get involved in the open space planning process. Let's get that as an important component of the plan. Let's have that as an implementation step, and then let's go do it and use the open space plan, as a part of a foundation for getting those things done.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for all the insights that you just provided us. I learned some stuff. I hope that everybody else here did as well. So huge thank you to Matt and Howard. Again, I'm Greg. So if you have any questions related to beginning with habitat or open space, or want to get in touch with these guys or other folks, you're welcome to email me, gregory.leclair@maine.gov. Tom, any closing remarks?
Not really. Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you for making this month very easy for me. So this was great. Thank you, Howard. Matt, I look forward to reviewing your comp plan. We just accepted it, I don't know, maybe 2 days ago for review. So Greg's already got his copy in his hand, so he'll be providing comments here in a couple weeks. Yes, thank you everyone else. Just a reminder that our next webinar will be Friday, August 1st. The session will focus on updates to shoreline zoning. We'll see you in August, and please send us any suggestions for future topics you may have. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.